In this first sermon, Jesus stands up and reads from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 61 to be exact, and he began to read. And it's largely from this prophecy where we glean the mission of Jesus. The Spirit of the Lord is on me. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to deliver those who are crushed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. By quoting these words, Jesus would have stirred the hopes of his people. Hopes for that time, the time of Isaiah and other prophets, had urged the people to wait for, to pray for, to prepare for the coming of the day of the Lord, the acceptable year of the Lord, which would mark the eschaton, the end of the old order and the ushering in of the new. The arrival of the Lord's anointed, or the Messiah, and the promised year of Jubilee where all debts are forgiven. Now, if there hadn't already been a buzz about Jesus, his choice of text would have gotten one going. People would have been saying things like, something's coming. I don't know what it is, but it's going to be great. See, the folks in Nazareth knew Jesus as Joseph's son. And they had heard about the healings in Capernaum and thought maybe Jesus would do something great also in his own country. This is a defining moment in the life and ministry of Jesus. It is one where we learn that his purpose is to give hope for the poor, sight to the blind, release to the captive, liberation for all those who are oppressed, and to proclaim debt forgiveness in the year of Jubilee. Now, given what we know about Jesus, what does this say about the priorities of our lives today as we seek to follow in his footsteps? Who are the ones that we ought to be most concerned about today? The rich and powerful? The poor and powerless? Where should the bulk of our time be spent as the Church of Jesus Christ? And would he even recognize us by that name? Where should we focus our resources? How do we appropriate our time and talent and treasure? These are just some of the hard questions that we need to be asking. When Jesus finished reading the gospel according to Luke, it says that he sat down to preach his sermon. Now, this was a practice of rabbinic teaching. The rabbi sat while the listeners stood. His message was simple. Very short, it seems. Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. A 2-second sermon. Now, the elders were impressed, Luke writes, that they all testified about him and wondered at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. And they said, well, isn't this Joseph's son? But Jesus doesn't stop here, and that's where the trouble begins. He went on to remind the elders of a time where there was great famine in Israel, and God had sent the prophet Elijah to a certain widow in the land of Sidon. Now, this was a story that the elders knew all too well, how God had used this poor, helpless widow and her unselfish devotion as the means by which to restore food and water and oil and wine to all the people of Israel. And out of faith, she spent her last drop of oil and her last handful of meal to feed the prophet Elijah. And so it was by her faith and obedience that God redeemed Israel. See, it wasn't a story the wealthy and privileged of the synagogue liked to hear. It rubbed them the wrong way. The widow of Sidon didn't square with their value system. Why, if anyone ought to be singled out as a model of faith, it ought to be one of the prominent men of the community, not some poor widow up north. Clearly, Jesus had gone from preaching to meddling. But he didn't stop there. He reminded them of yet another incident in Jewish history concerning a Syrian named Naaman. Naaman. This was set in the time of Elisha, Elijah's successor. Naaman was a leper who was cleansed by the power of God when all the other lepers, all Hebrews, mind you, were left unclean. Not only was Naaman an unlikely recipient of God's mercy, he was a Gentile, an outsider, not one of the people of God. Again, it was a story the elders did not care to hear. They wanted to hear about how God had favored the Jews, not some Syrian Gentile. They wanted to hear about how the Jews were God's chosen people and how salvation belonged to them. But Jesus was unrelenting. He was not trying to offend the elders, but he was determined to proclaim the prophecy of Isaiah that this good news was for all people. He was determined to proclaim the new creation that had begun, in which there is good news for the poor, release for captives, sight for the blind, liberation for all, where the oppressed are set free, and a year of jubilee is for all. See, Jesus made it clear. The good news is no longer, and really never had been, a gift for the people of God to hoard for themselves, but it was a responsibility to share graciously, open-handed with others. By the time Jesus finished speaking, the elders were outraged. They dragged him from the synagogue to the edge of a cliff, and they were prepared to throw him off to his death. But for some reason, they stopped short. The confrontation ended, and Jesus walked away unscathed. As I was listening to the radio this week, there was an interview and a presentation by Brian Stevenson. If you haven't had it, I encourage you to at least watch the movie Just Mercy. In this story and sharing of Brian, he talks about the histories that we've been taught to believe about who we are as white people and about who black people are. And he challenges us to realign, to reawaken the real narrative, to listen and look again like we talked about last week, because so much of it is a taught narrative, not a true narrative. This is exactly what Jesus is doing with the disciples and the religious leaders in that time. He's challenging them to confront ideologies and ideas that they've held in order to maintain their own power and comfort. I don't know if you've noticed, but in the Gospels of Jesus, part of what's happening is Jesus is continually calling those that follow him from their place of comfort to a place of discomfort, from a place of orientation to a place of disorientation, so that we can be reoriented. So here's a question. If you had been there, would you have reacted any differently? My point is, the way you answer the question says a lot about how we perceive ourselves as children of God. For the more that we're able to identify with the poor, the captive, the blind, the oppressed, the more likely we'll appreciate the good news of the gospel that Jesus is offering. But to put it differently, the more you're able to see yourself standing among the ranks of those deemed unworthy to receive God's love, the more likely you'll find yourself standing in the company of Jesus. See, Jesus draws a line in the sand for the religious leaders. And he invites them to join him, to see the world as it really is. But instead, they nearly killed him. Today, the good news of Jesus draws a line in the sand for us. And again, it invites us to his side. So do we join him? Or do we take him outside of our proverbial cities because the things he's saying and doing make us uncomfortable? Or do we choose to ignore the power of the message because it afflicts our comfort? Joseph Hart said it best when he penned these words. Come ye sinners, poor and needy, weak and wounded, sick and sore. Jesus ready stands to save you, full of pity, love, and power. Let not conscience make you linger, nor of fitness fondly dream. All the fitness he requires is to fill your need of him. Come, you weary and heavy laden, bruised and mangled by the fall. If you tarry till you're better, you'll never come at all. So what do you think? What do you think healing the brokenhearted looks like for the church today? What about for you individually? How will you heal the brokenhearted? What do you think releasing the captives looks like for the church today? And what about you individually? What do you think recovering sight for the blind looks like for the church today? And what about you individually? What do you think freeing the oppressed looks like for the church today? And what about you individually? What do you think delivering the crushed looks like for the church today? And what about you individually? What do you think proclaiming the year of Jubilee looks like for the church today? And what about you individually? As Jesus draws his line in the sand and afflicts our comfort, will we step to the other side?